This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Você que está ouvindo esse podcast, o que acha de uma empresa que sempre trabalha para trazer impacto positivo? Assim é o Google. Como? A Duda da Orbi é um exemplo disso. Ela usa a inteligência artificial para ajudar pessoas a recuperarem seus movimentos. É a tecnologia mais útil na vida das pessoas. E tem o Jefferson da Tributei, que usa inteligência artificial para facilitar o dia a dia das empresas. Eles e milhares de empreendedores geraram mais de 188 bilhões com as plataformas do Google. Tem que ser bom para todo mundo.
Welcome to Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming back a returning guest, and that is Mike Lund. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Glad to be back.
Glad to have you back. Not as enthused about the movie that we're going to be talking about today, to be honest. But before we get into that, why don't you remind people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am both a fan of film and video games, which always makes it a pleasure to come on here. So on film, I am on Letterboxd as Lobaka, Lowbacca. And then I do a retro video game podcast called The Old Switcheroo, which is going through the entire Nintendo Switch Online retro catalog, which covers the NES, SNES, Genesis, N64, Game Boy, and Game Boy Advance, with a little over 250 games right now that are available to anyone that has a Switch and has that subscription.
Okay, awesome. And anything you've been playing that's really been catching your eye on that front?
I think the most recent that we've released was a franchise called Joe and Mac, which was Caveman Ninja in Japan, and then came to the US as Joe and Mac, which I had never heard of before. And there's apparently 4 games in that franchise, at least 2 of which I find very, very fun to play. So that has actually been a pleasant surprise that I never knew existed until now.
It's surprising they would change the name like that, because if you told me a video game called Joe and Mac, I wouldn't give it a second look. But if you told me a game called Caveman Ninja, then I'd be like, okay, you've got my attention now.
Yeah, it's odd, and it started out as Caveman Ninja, and so actually of the 4 games, the main cavemen of Joe and Mac are only in the first, third, and fourth. They're not in the second one.
Okay.
So there's a lot of questions I have about the development of this that I still don't feel comfortable with answers about how some decisions were made there. I think I'm skeptical that the last one I played is actually the arcade game Joe and Mac Returns, which was sort of the fourth in that. And I don't even know if that made it into the US officially, because it's the kind of thing that feels like it was going to be censored if it was released in the US in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So okay. It's an enigma, but it's been some fun games.
Okay, very cool. And this episode is coming out probably in the summer, but we're recording this back in March. So if you guys go and check out the podcast, you might have to do a little bit of digging to go back and find those episodes. But anyway, today go ahead.
And I'll just say, and at that point, we're currently, at the time of us filming this, we're on sort of a season break, but we'll be in our second season by the time this comes out.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. So guys, please make sure to check that out. But anyway, today we are talking about another of the movies in the Godzilla franchise. So far, we've only covered 2 of the movies on this show. I covered the original Godzilla from 1954 back when this show was in its first phase, when I was just doing the episode solo. And then we had Mark Buskett on few seasons ago, and we talked about Shin Godzilla, which is one of my favorite films. And we had a really good time talking about that. And I've said this before. I've never really explored any of the other Japanese Godzilla movies. I've seen the American ones. I've seen the Roland Emmerich's terrible version. I've seen the Monarch ones and enjoyed them to varying degrees. Some of them I really liked, others have just kind of been like, it's all right. And the Monarch TV series, I finished the first season of that fairly recently, which I really dug that. But I haven't really yet had a chance to really dive into a lot of the Japanese films other than the original and Shin Godzilla. And I'm very familiar with them in terms of reputation. But today we are talking about the second film, which is the English title is Godzilla Raids Again, which is kind of a misnomer because of the Godzilla we're talking about in this, but the Japanese title is a little bit more accurate. It's called Godzilla no Gyakshou, which literally translates to Godzilla's counterattack. That would probably be a more accurate title based on what the content of this movie is. But before we dive too much into this movie, and you got to forgive me for my memory because I recorded a bunch of episodes that you were on last season. They're all like back to back. And I think we had a few people whose history with Japanese films was through Godzilla. So if I'm treading over ground you've already covered, my apologies, but what is your history with Godzilla?
So I think the first of the Godzilla films that I ever saw, and I think it is an amazing film, was Godzilla Final Wars, which is a ridiculous film. And then I've gradually accumulated mostly Showa era Godzilla in watching a lot of that. So I've seen a couple of the newer US made Godzilla movies, and I've seen most of just the Showa era. I think there's a couple that I'm missing. So actually for this, I have finally broken into my Criterion collection of the Showa era Godzilla. And then I think my feelings about Godzilla, I think, are very in line with what you talked about in your episode when you talked about it. I went into it having already seen certainly Final Wars and some of the later Showa era Godzilla. And I really did have this idea of Godzilla, it's, monster movie, guy in suit kind of thing. And I think Godzilla is a masterpiece with so much sort of symbolism that it's really underrated because it is a lot more than I think of what the franchise has often gotten associated with. And it's partially also why I suggested talking Godzilla Raids Again, because for Godzilla, there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of themes that I clearly picked up and saw what was going on. And then Godzilla Raids Again kind of had to follow that up. That's a tough challenge. And so I'm looking forward to this just to sort of get another perspective that is, with your perspective, having a much better understanding of Japan, to sort of see what is it that I may not be noticing in this.
Okay, so that's a good place to start. And I'm going to be honest up front. Like I said, I'm not looking forward so much to discussing this. I had seen parts of this before. Like I picked up, even though I haven't seen any of the other ones up until recently, it's just been Godzilla and Shin Godzilla up until this film. I did pick up the entire Godzilla collection a while back, and something I was going to start diving into. And I'd started watching Godzilla Raids Again, and I just I didn't really like it that first time I watched it. I was only kind of half paying attention to be honest. So it didn't really grab my attention that first time I watched it. And it kind of caused me to take a pause on going through the rest of the Showa era. And I just kind of put them to the side, and I figure I'll just put them on the list. And if it comes up and people want to talk about it, then I'll go into and start watching them. But yeah, I mean, and since then we did cover not a Godzilla film, but it is and I'm blanking on the name of it right now. But it is another one of those monster movies. I think it was Gorath, maybe, was it? Yeah, Gorath, I think that was the one. Which was Also, not quite my cup of tea, although it did try some interesting things. And then this one, like when you ask about the themes and stuff like this and how it, reflects like the Japanese setting and all that, to be honest, I am not seeing a whole lot of depth in this movie. I'm not seeing like a whole lot of attempts to reach the same kind of dig into this themes or even have the same care with like the monster battles and all that Ishiro Honda clearly was doing with the original Godzilla. But before we dive too much into that, what's kind of, I mean, I know you kind of talked about it briefly, but a little bit more in depth, what was kind of like, if you can remember the first time you saw this movie, what was kind of your initial impressions of it and what were you thinking? How did it compare on this most recent watch?
So I think I first saw it a handful of years ago, probably 2 to 4, somewhere in there. And I think I'm kind of at a sort of a consistent spot on this, which is it feels like a movie that it's where it's, or at least to me, it feels like it's where it's breaking away from having a lot of these sort of themes and symbolism and allegory and all this into they've just made a very successful monster movie and are now intending to make more of it, and they're not really sure how to do that because they're playing up a part that wasn't really the focus of the first movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for as much as it being the first one being called Godzilla, so much of it is indirectly about that. And so to shift to now we want the monster to be a much larger portion of this, how do we really turn this into, how do we develop into really kaiju films as a thing? That kind of feels like they weren't really sure how to do it. And so it's not that I think this is a bad film. Like I do enjoy it, but it doesn't feel like it stands out as much as some of the later, even the later Showa era films, where I feel like they started to figure out really how do you make this work well. And so it kind of feels like it's watching this learning process of there's something here, but we don't really know how to use it right yet.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick correction, I just realized that I'd said Gorath was the other film we had covered that Honda directed. He did direct that, but the one we had actually covered was Dogora. So I'm just correction for anybody who is listening along with the seasons, like, wait, that wasn't the movie you talked about. So just a quick correction on that. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you see elements of, because the Showa era films, even if you haven't seen them, that's like where the popular conception of Godzilla as like kind of campy, cheesy monster movies, guys in suits, smacking each other around model cities, Japanese people shouting, "Oh look, Godzilla!" Like that. All that kind of like stereotypical images people have of Godzilla mostly comes from the Showa films, especially the later ones. And you look at this movie and it's not quite that, right? They are, I think there is an intent here to tell like a serious human drama and also kind of transition into what would become the formula of Godzilla battling giant monsters, because obviously they realize, kind of rightly, that we don't want to just remake the original one and have, Godzilla attacking Japan and then having, a new kind of master weapon that's ultimate weapon that's going to destroy him again. And to their credit, they did attempt to try something a little bit different and try to bring in this idea of, well, if and it mostly follows the continuity of the previous film. There's one thing that I noticed that seems a little bit incongruous, but I'll get to that. But again, I said earlier that the title Godzilla Raids Again is kind of a misnomer because this isn't the same Godzilla as in the first movie. Takashi Shimura, who played Professor Yamane in the first film, he returns for a cameo in this film where he kind of explains, kind of like the history of Godzilla, and he talks about how the first Godzilla was destroyed by the oxygen destroyer, and he says very, very bluntly, like, that Godzilla is gone. He's at the bottom of Tokyo Bay. This is another Godzilla. And also we have Anguirus, who is a mutated dinosaur, and this creature is what what ends up fighting Godzilla, and this new version of Godzilla anyway. But most of the story is not about that. Most of the story is centered around the two pilots who first discover Godzilla and Anguirus. We have Kobayashi and Tsukioka, and it's mostly about their story, the relationship with Hidemi, and honestly, like, one of the trademarks of there are two main trademarks that we see in the American Godzilla movies. We see that we have, big monster battles that are very fun to look at, very, action packed, some great use of special effects, but often kind of minimized at the expense of a human drama that, for the most part, is largely uninteresting. Like, most of the human drama stories in the legendary Godzilla films outside of the Monarch series, I've got no interest in. I was kind of into, Bryan Cranston's character in the first Godzilla, and also Serizawa, who was played by Ken Watanabe in the first one and in King of the Monsters. But then when we get into Godzilla versus Kong and we got into these other characters, I could not care less. And I feel like this film really kind of establishes that formula that Legendary would end up using decades later, where we've got some scenes of some monster battles, and there are some really good use of special effects there, particularly in the scenes of like the cities being destroyed. I thought they did a good job with those. The monster fight itself felt a little bit uninteresting to me. But the human drama in this, I found it really boring, to be honest. Like, I don't know. How about you? What did you think about that?
I actually kind of enjoy it on this one. There's some of the others in the Showa era that I think the human drama has serious issues between just being distracting and bad. This one I actually kind of like, because it has an interesting way that sort of it entangles all of this and manages to connect the pieces from battle to battle, since you have these pilots, and that allows, since they are pilots that are doing effectively reconnaissance for fishing, so they're connected to the ocean. And then in one of the more interesting bits, I guess to me, to see a movie talk about this, is they also have connections to sort of the military of Japan, because they had flown in the war. And it was interesting just kind of to see a little bit of a mention of, I think I'm used to seeing sort of talks about having served in wars tend to be the victors talking about it. Like, there's tons of US movies that talk about, the people who won the war after the war. It's kind of interesting to see this sort of thing where it is just like, that's the thing that happened, and it's been almost a decade now, or just over a decade. And it's just like, that's a thing that they had done, that I actually thought was an small, interesting thing to it. But that sort of allows them to connect to what's going on with Godzilla in a way that didn't feel as forced as I think other films kind of do, where you have to try to get humans to all the places that this is happening coincidentally.
I think that's a fair point. Again, I don't have the familiarity with the Showa films that you do, so, and I think just based on reputation, this seems like, something that is better than a lot of the Showa films that would come later, when it does kind of get into the slapsticky, more kind of like kid-friendly type of action, and it's just more focused on the big monster battles and rubber suits.
And even though some of those can be good when they really have, like, for me, this kind of I looked at sort of my overall ratings of the Godzilla films, and this one falls pretty much right in the middle. There's ones that I like better. There's ones that I like much less. So this is kind of in the middle for me.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah, and I think that, and I'm not saying that to be disparaging, obviously, right? You can do camp and it can be fun. I mean, I was a huge Power Rangers fan back in the day, so I definitely know all about how that kind of like, and one of my complaints actually about the Power Rangers reboot movie they did a few years ago was that it took itself a little bit too seriously. And with a concept like Godzilla, yeah, you can go campy with it and you can be fun. And I think, again, I have not seen these films, but you mentioned Final Wars as one of your favorites. I believe that was Ryuhei Kitamura who directed that, who also did Versus and did a lot of other really great movies. And from what I understand from that film's reputation, it kind of does a really good job of straddling this line between camp and serious action.
I'd say it has some serious action. It is also thoroughly ridiculous. At points, it is, I would say, incredibly so. So that there is a comic tone to some of that. I believe that's the one where Godzilla defeats the American Godzilla in like 10 seconds, which is a nice touch.
I know it wasn't one of the ones he directed. I can't remember if it was that one exactly, but I do know that that's one of the things that was mentioned by people who had seen it. But yeah, for me, I think I get your point about the veteran aspect of it. And I think there would have been a way to kind of do something like with that, because this came out in 1955. Which was shortly after the creation of the SDF, and that would have been something to focus on, because there was actually a lot of anxiety in Japan at the time that the SDF was created. Like, even the Japanese Constitution, famously, says that they reject war as a means of settling international disputes, and they declare themselves a pacifist nation. And it was actually the U.S. who kind of imposed the SDF on Japan, because the Korean War had started. They needed Japan's support, and they're like, we need you guys to help come in, and we need you to kind of, create a military force. And the reaction of the government was like, I thought we were supposed to be pacifists now. We don't want to go down this route again. And under pressure from the U.S., they did create the SDF, and it was very controversial by the Japanese public. Most of the Japanese public is like, we thought we were done with this shit. What are you doing? And so I think that would have been an interesting place to kind of dig into some deeper themes about this. You have these two guys who did serve in war. They'd seen, what war was like. They had experienced the treatment of the Japanese military. The imperial military was famously did not have the best treatment of its soldiers, so especially the lower level people. So it would have been a very interesting place to kind of explore some themes in that. But ultimately, I don't think this film is really interested in digging into any kind of deeper themes, at least not in the same way that Honda was.
Yeah, and I do wonder to what extent that was sort of an external pressure, because I think in looking at this, I believe I saw some stuff that within Japan, this was viewed as a stronger film than the first one, in part because trying to do commentary in sci-fi and trying to talk about stuff like the atomic bombings and stuff was a touchy subject that sort of there's issues of whether or not it was in good taste. And so I can certainly see, on one hand, pressure to, if that was the part that got criticism, pressure to move away from that. And then on the other hand is also that this was, I believe Godzilla came out in November of the previous year, and this came out in May of 55. So this is like 6 months from the release of the last movie, at a time where you didn't presume you were starting a multi-decade franchise with every movie you make. And so to go from we finished the movie, we've released it, to, oh wait, now we need to do another. I can also see that taking a lot more time to really figure out what to do, and having a lot more oversight that's going on in terms of trying to determine how you handle that now that it's got that much attention. And so I can see that being the kind of thing that strips out slightly more controversial takes, or pushing into topics that are a little bit more taboo. And so I think that kind of limits it a bit. Yes,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something I wanted to bring up as well. It did it did have a better critical reception than the original one did. And Honda had said that critics at the time, you know, they like you said, they had this very dismissive view of science fiction, and the idea that this genre could have any sort of exploration of serious themes or ideas was, you know, kind of viewed at as, you know, I guess a good way of saying it is like, you know, imagine like a kid putting on his dad's clothes. You know, you don't take it seriously. You look at it, you laugh at it, you think it's funny, but nobody is going to take it seriously. And I think that's kind of how a lot of critics viewed what Honda was trying to do with the original Godzilla. And you can also see that in the, you know, the American version of it when they had cut down a lot of the serious themes. I think a lot of that was because of politics at the time as well. And it wasn't until decades later that people got to see the original uncut Japanese version, and they got to see that, oh, wow, no, this is actually a very serious, thoughtful, you know, deep movie. And even beyond like the atomic bomb stuff, just like some of the conversations they have about the whether or not it's appropriate to try and destroy Godzilla, like those are at the time I would have told, if you told me that there's it's a giant monster film and there is a serious discussion that goes into the ethical notions of whether or not it's okay to destroy a giant monster, I would have said like, well, that'd be a ridiculous conversation. You can't make that believable. You know, Takashi Shimura and Ishido Honda, they made that discussion believable. They made that point of view make a lot of sense. And I think, I think that a big reason why they kind of avoided a lot of those themes was because of that criticism that the first film had. Again, like I said, I don't think this film was interested in exploring any sort of deeper themes, which is probably a good thing that, at least from the producer's point of view, that Honda wasn't available to direct this film. I mean, he probably would have come back, but he was in the middle of directing something else at the time. And so instead they brought in Motoyoshi Oda to direct it instead. And whether or not Oda was interested in it or whether he was just following studio mandate or whatever it was, he obviously didn't go that same route that Honda did. And I don't know about Oda's background, but Honda especially had personal experiences in the war. He had been in the military, so he had seen firsthand what it had done. And you know, yeah, he during World War II, Oda was still working on movies in Japan, so he was never in the military at all. But I think going back to the idea of the two pilots being, you know, veterans, that's also, you can also see that theme coming up in the original Godzilla, where you have Serizawa, who had been in the war, who had lost an eye in the war, and his experiences in the war had really shaped his worldview. And I haven't seen it yet, but my understanding that the recent Minus Zero also does something similar, because the main character in that is a former kamikaze pilot. So all of that, very interesting ideas to explore, and it just kind of left on the ground. It's just kind of left there on the floor, and nobody touches it. Which again, given what they were trying to do, it's understandable, but it's also, from my perspective, disappointing.
Yeah, like I said, it's why it feels like it was the shift away from this into more of a focused on the monsters kind of approach. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't know how to do that quite yet. And I think, especially with the rush, that I don't think that helped. So like there are elements of this that I think feel underdeveloped. One of the things that comes to mind, and I can see the approach of trying to put something in that makes it feel like a real problem that would occur, where you have a full evacuation underway and you have prisoners that are having to be transferred that get loose, and it kind of feels like a loose end that mostly exists to cause some additional large scale problems. But it's the kind of thing that feels like I would like to see what that could have been if they'd had more time to flesh out that into something that felt a bit more integrated, a bit more tied into the story.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I go back to Shin Godzilla and how well the human stories in that really work with the monster story. Whereas again, in like the legendary, which is why I say this feels like a spiritual precursor to the legendary films, because it's got that same idea where it's got these human stories that don't connect so well to the monster narrative, and it just kind of feels. And again, I know you said you kind of enjoyed it, but from my perspective, I found it very kind of dull, and it. I mean, and to his credit, Minoru Chiaki is a good actor. He does try as Kobayashi, but it's just none of these characters speak to me in the same way the characters in the original Godzilla film did.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I like it, but it's definitely, I'd say almost entirely across the board, it feels lacking compared to what came right before it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one spot that I actually think this is actually still really impressive, and it's had a lot to live up to, is I actually think the music in this is really good and well used. Does a great job of adding to the atmosphere
Mm-hmm.
of some of these scenes, and I find that particularly impressive because the music in Godzilla, like the theme that has become associated with Godzilla, is so good that that's a really tough sort of role, because it's a different composer to come
Mm-hmm.
in. And I didn't realize it was a different composer because the music still had this sort of this boldness to it, I guess, if nothing else, of creating this tension with these bold, loud themes, that it feels like it's the same sort of tone to it. And I guess I believe I wrote this down and now I can't find where. That the composer here was basically studying Godzilla and was like, how do I do anything this good? And really felt a pressure for that, and I think he succeeded. Because I think in that case, with his view being that I didn't realize this was a different composer, I think is probably something he would take as a compliment, because I think he did put music together that lived up to that without just being reused the Godzilla theme. And so I do appreciate that it's interesting that it's scoring that's usually used if nothing's being said, so there's not much dialogue with score, but when they're using it for scenes, it's very, very effective at either conveying tension as they're searching for Godzilla, or there's actually a song that does have lyrics that they use when Osaka thinks that sort of they're safe, that has this sort of tranquil kind of relaxation thing to it. And it just does a great job setting mood. And I think it's the one spot that this movie is on pretty much the same footing as the original, is how good the music was.
See, I had not really paid much attention to the music in this way. I think, and this is just, again, this is my personal thing. I'm someone who music tends to fade in the background to me for movies, unless it's either something that is very jarring or something that is very, very good. So like the original Godzilla theme, that theme is seared into my mind because it is just used so effectively at the right times. This one, I didn't have the same reaction to it. And the composer, Masaru Sato, this is something he had said about this, is that, yeah, you are right. He did have a lot of reverence for Akira Ifukube, who did the score in the original Godzilla. And he found it to be a massive challenge to do the score for the sequel. And later on, when he said that listening to his work on this movie, it's like listening to a kid trying to learn. So he's I think he feels like he didn't quite do it justice. I will say I didn't notice it in a bad way. So that's definitely a mark in its favor, right? It's just kind of like a typical score then for my point of view.
Yeah.
But also one of the things about this is and I mentioned the continuity kind of flub, because maybe I'm misremembering something, or maybe the subtitles weren't translated correctly, but in this movie, they say that Godzilla was created by the hydrogen bomb. That's not my memory of the first movie. My memory of the first movie is that Godzilla is a prehistoric creature and he was always there, but he was awakened by the hydrogen bomb tests. So this movie seems to, and then I remember when, so the first Godzilla movie I saw was Roland Emmerich's film. And in that movie, they make it very clear that Godzilla has been mutated as a result of atomic testing or something along those lines. And I thought, oh, okay, that must have been how it had happened in the original movie too. And then when I saw the original movie and they said, no, Godzilla was awakened by a hydrogen bomb, I'm like, oh, okay, I guess they changed it for the American movie. But then I watched this and now it seems like they changed the history, and maybe this was an attempt to kind of get away from the notion of the atomic bomb criticism and instead focus on the idea of just, standard radiation makes things big kind of approach that a lot of 50s sci-fi movies were doing at the time. I don't know. Did you notice that? Did you have any thoughts about that aspect of it?
I hadn't noticed that. I did find it interesting that so with I cannot pronounce the proper name that they used for it. The Anguirus.
I think it's Anguirus. Yeah, I'm not
Anguirus.
positive though.
Is one of the things
the Japanese is Anguirus, so and Anguirus is a pretty good Americanization of it.
Is that's basically an ankylosaurus.
Yes.
And I think they do mention that as another name for it. And so one of the interesting things is when they talk about that, and they're like, well, that's an ankylosaurus. It lived 70 to 150 million years ago, I think is the number they give. And they're like, this was basically alive at the same, that's the same time that Godzilla is from. So I think that was interesting that they did kind of give sort of an era for Godzilla. So I think if it was in the version that I was seeing, I didn't really register now they're saying Godzilla is created versus awakened, because I think in my mind, they put it as Godzilla's from this point in time.
Yeah, I noticed that part too when they said they existed at the same time as Godzilla. So that really confused me. So it may have been a mistranslation of the subtitles. Maybe they had meant to, maybe that and I couldn't hear the Japanese as clearly, so I couldn't double check on it. But I think maybe it was that they had said awakened and it was mistranslated as created. But whatever the case, it felt like a little. It was something that definitely jumped out to me, and I even rewound the movie to double check that I had gotten it right. Now, what did you think of kind of the monster battles in this?
It's definitely interesting to see that this feels like. So there's sort of this interesting thing with how to view. So this is less of how they appear as film, but more as sort of structures. Is there's sort of a gradual shift in how they use Godzilla, from Godzilla being necessarily coming in and Godzilla is destroying Tokyo, to here where they're worried about Godzilla, and instead you have Anguirus show up, and then Godzilla comes in and fights Anguirus, and it kind of feels like this is the first step towards what some of the others would show, where you kind of get into this situation where Godzilla is sometimes a threat and sometimes sort of almost I don't want to say hero, but that sometimes Godzilla is maybe the lesser of evils. Perhaps that, because I think most of the destruction from Godzilla actually is that battle where Godzilla shows up second. And so the city's already in trouble. And then the rest of it is not actual fights. And so it does feel like it's an evolution in how they use Godzilla that I think is interesting. And I think visually, yes, they're guys in suits, but I get past enough disbelief to really enjoy it. And I think they do great model work with these. And so I think that certainly helps. And so I think like the battle scenes I think work well.
Mm.
I'm a little bit less sure with towards the end when it's Godzilla on his own and they're trying to trap Godzilla. There's something about the scale on some of those shots that just doesn't feel right to me.
Mm-hmm.
Since we get into the situation where they've cornered Godzilla onto an island with a lot of snow. And I think it's just got to be something with how they're doing that and the scales involved, that they're using chunks of something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it, in my mind, it only feels like I must be seeing a much smaller Godzilla, like a miniature Godzilla and salt or something weird, and which is not what it is, because I know it. It's like that doesn't match the scale, but it's these weird chunks that don't feel right for the setting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only a few shots that do that. It distracts me a bit, but there's not too many of those shots. So it makes that bit feel a bit weird to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the original things they had wanted to do in the fight scenes is the director actually wanted to film them in slow motion. But then there's a mistake in filming. They actually accidentally did it the opposite way, and they filmed it at like, at double speed or something like that. And then he saw the result, and he actually really kind of liked that effect more, and he decided to go to stick with that anyway. I'm not sure if I agree that was the best decision. I think showing it in slow motion may have been a little bit better. It may have gotten a better sense for kind of like the scale of these things. And I think, and a big thing too is just this is the first time they're doing this. So I cut them a lot of slack on that aspect of it, because the first Godzilla movie, it was just Godzilla. They didn't have to worry about how would he look fighting another monster. Whereas this one, they're trying to figure out, okay, we've got these two guys in rubber suits. They're supposed to be playing these like prehistoric giant creatures. How do we make this work? There's a definite sense of that going on. And I think they do the best we could have expected of them at the time. It still, I think, kind of pales in comparison to the scale and the feeling of intensity that we got in that first movie. And I think a big part of that is just, I feel like Honda had a better understanding of the limitations of the special effects he was working with, and he compensated for those. Whereas this one, it feels like they're just more about, let's just throw them on screen and let's just film them. And whereas one of the things I always talk about in that original Godzilla movie when I show it to my students is that the way that Honda consistently films Godzilla in darkness, and he uses these kind of close-up shots and these low-angle shots, with the exception of like one shot when you see one or two shots when you see Godzilla's eyes, and it really kind of drives home the fact this is a rubber suit and it almost breaks the suspension of disbelief. With the exception of like two shots in that movie, mostly it stays consistent, and it uses that intelligent use of cinematography to make you feel that this creature is real. I found that suspension of disbelief kind of breaking when you see them kind of like wrestling together like that.
Yeah, I think for the first one, especially the way you describe that, feels very similar to the way like Jaws is talked about.
Exactly.
The shark is used in a very limited way, and so it does a very good job of hiding all the problems that are at play.
Yeah.
So I think there is,
which famously was actually an accident. It was They were supposed to have more of the shark, but the robot wouldn't work right. So then they had to just use so Spielberg decided like, all right, well, let's just try using suggestion instead, which ended up working a lot better.
Yeah. And so there's certainly some element to that. And then I think when it comes to something like the speed, so this is that their intent was that the fight should have been in slower motion than what it actually is, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of almost think that there's a dangerous game, because I've seen movies that have done that where I have actually felt like the slow motion broke things feeling more natural. American movie Night of the Lepus is heavily reliant on models because it is giant rabbits. And there's something about the slow motion there that I think really doesn't work. So there's a point to it where I think almost that kind of slow motion, I think, would have messed with the sense of tension, I think, personally, or at least for me.
I think there's a balancing act I think you have to have in that, because I definitely see your point, and I'm reminded of Zack Snyder's Justice League, where he definitely overused slow motion in that movie. Um, but I think if you had a combination of maybe not necessarily slow motion, but slower motion, and a bit more creative thinking with the camera angles, I think it could have made. I think it could have been the battle could have been conveyed in a much more realistic fashion. I think also another reason why they wouldn't put that kind of care into it is just because, again, that rush schedule. Because this movie, you know, the producer, he had he had been out of Japan when Godzilla was released, and he came to Japan after working on Madame Butterfly, and like as soon as he came back, it was already after the release of Godzilla, and he'd been told what a massive success it had been, and his first orders were make another one. And so then they're like, okay, well, we have to rush this in like less than 6 months. And I think that shortened production schedule, combined with the fact that they're doing things that have never been done before, and they, again, they did the best they could, but it doesn't quite hold together as well. I also think it's nice that they tried to do some different things, and instead of having going after Tokyo again, instead they changed it to Osaka this time. I thought that was a nice touch too, to showcase a different locale, and it kind of reminds me of what the James Bond films used to be, where it was like, people, this is before the internet, people aren't going to be able to travel the world and stuff a lot. So a lot of the ways that people can experience these different locations is through movies. And so this is a good way of doing that too. Instead of showing Tokyo again, now we get to see Osaka. We get to see a different part of Japan. Um, and as someone who is very kind of disappointed whenever I hear people talk about Japan and they just mean Tokyo, and they don't realize that there's a whole other country besides Tokyo, and that Tokyo is really kind of its own thing. Um, it is nice to see a movie that did get this kind of worldwide release, focusing on a different part of the country instead of always just, oh, it's Tokyo.
Yeah, and actually has a fair seems to cover a fair range of country, because I think the climax is also a fake island far to the north of Japan.
It's in Hokkaido, yeah.
That I think like, because they give coordinates. If you put the coordinates in, that's the sea north of Japan somewhere, at a place that does not actually have an island.
Right, yeah, but it is in the Hokkaido region though. Although I like the decision to go there, and I think that is it's kind of a creative way to find out to incapacitate Godzilla, because you don't have the benefit of another ultimate weapon and plus that would feel like, kind of a cop out too. It's like, okay, well, the oxygen destroyer is gone, but now we have the, you know, hydrogen destroyer or whatever. And that would have felt, like a disappointment if they just tried to use some other ultimate weapon. So instead, using this idea of having him frozen in the ice and having him, covered in an avalanche, it's a pretty creative way to solve that problem. Although I'm not quite I'm kind of disappointed with the way that they get to Hokkaido, because it almost feels like that Godzilla is following the human characters, because you know he destroys the cannery, Yamaji's cannery in Osaka. So then he decides he's going to move his operations to Hokkaido, and and then in Hokkaido, Godzilla pops up again. So I think it would have been better if Godzilla was, after he destroyed Osaka, he continued north and then they followed him to Hokkaido. Would have made a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, I can see that point.
Because I think it was speaking of Jaws, I think it was Jaws 2 or one of the Jaws sequels where it's pretty much it. And I never saw it, but I just remember from Reputation that the shark is following this family to a new location.
What I say, I think it's like Jaws 4: The Revenge.
That might have
been
something. 4, yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, because 3 had to have been a 3D thing. So yeah, I think Jaws 4: The Revenge, I think is the correct.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't 3
because
I think 3 was the one with Michael Caine. I knew that wasn't the one, but yeah, I do remember one of the movies they had that plot where it's just like it's the same family and the shark is following them to a new location. I got kind of that sense here when Godzilla follows them to Hokkaido. It felt either incredibly coincidental or just incredibly whatever it was, like the monster is intentionally tracking them. It just didn't work for me in that. And I think it would have been worked out much better if he had decided like, I'm going to start moving north. And that would have probably given a chance to showcase some other scenes of like, maybe going through some other cities, maybe, going along the coast and then eventually moving up to Hokkaido. I think that would have made for something a lot more interesting, but they just kind of like say like, oh, we're in Hokkaido and like, hey, look, here's Godzilla again.
Yeah. I feel like it isn't something that I had a strong reaction to because I think I sort of just figured the geography works. That I don't know the geography well enough to know whether or not it necessarily makes sense or not. And I can certainly see if they're doing this on the rush, if you wanted to feature multiple locations, that starts to get into more time. And so I can certainly see that as that would be cool. That's tough to do. And I certainly feel like in later films, they do a more thorough job of sort of featuring additional places. And I think that's probably at the point where once you know this is a franchise, then you can plan to sort of set things up for representing multiple areas a lot easier.
Yeah, the geography is really bizarre because I can show you a map here and you can see what I'm talking about. All right, so if you can see here, like here is Osaka right here. So it's not even on the coast, right? It's kind of like this it's in the bay here. And then you've got Hokkaido is all the way up here in the north. So the geography of this, like if he's just, kind of going there, it doesn't quite work. I mean, it's one thing if maybe it was, in Miyagi or something like that, or Fukushima, and then goes up to Hokkaido. It would make a little bit more sense that way because they're not that far off for a creature that size. But to go from Osaka here all the way up to Hokkaido here, it feels very disjointed. It doesn't quite, and it felt like, I think this was also a consequence of not really having the time to plan things out because they're probably just kind of like, oh, well, what do we do about Godzilla? How do we stop him? It's like, oh, well, let's have him frozen in ice. Well, okay, so he's got to get to a place where there's snow, so that means we got to get him up to Hokkaido. And it's like, he just appears there.
Yeah, although I think to be fair, to me at least, they gave a sense that a fair amount of time has passed. Mm-hmm. That to me, it feels like it has been weeks or something. So there is a little bit of, there is the sort of what the heck happened to Godzilla question that does feel like it's floating around there. But I do feel like when after Osaka is destroyed, and so you do have sort of some people go to Hokkaido, but not everybody. Kind of the way that does that sort of makes it feel like, okay, this is going to be that when they all meet up in Hokkaido again. It did feel to me like that we were looking at weeks, maybe even months later.
Possibly, yeah. They although I don't think it was that far because they did have that party there, and that felt to me like and again, this is a Japanese business culture thing, is when people go to a new location, a new branch or whatever, there's always a welcome party. And it's usually like the night they arrive. So
yeah, but I think that was the second half of getting there. Did you have I think it's Kobayashi that goes first?
Says he sends him there to guide trawlers and then during a company dinner. I can't remember the exact timing of it, but
yeah, so I think they send him first and then the others come later, because by the time he gets there, like when they get there, he's known by everybody as Mr. Groom. Like he's developed into this whole, like, everybody knows him as that kind of new character. you learn that he's found a woman he's interested in and all this kind of stuff. So like there's so much that has changed with him between Osaka destroyed and they all meet up again in Hokkaido. That to me, it, without having to say, it's been X number of weeks, it felt like enough time had passed to allow Godzilla to have moved on a fair bit.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it does feel like it feels like the movie doesn't do a good job of conveying that.
Yeah. I definitely see that's a lot of Japan to get through without anything noteworthy happening.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
And, so I think it's
no real reason for him to get there. So it does, I mean, and even if it is there, it's, sometime later, it does feel oddly coincidental that the first time that he pops up again is in the place where our main characters just so happen to have relocated to.
Yeah, that part is definitely.
And if we had just had like some indication of some reason why Godzilla had gone up there, I think it would have, and it could have just been like a simple line of dialogue or something. I think it would have gone a long way. So any other things that really kind of stood out to you? The other thing I really wanted to mention is I was glad to see Yamane back for that brief cameo, although I'm really disappointed that that's all we see of him, and especially given his role in the first film and how he was very much against destroying Godzilla until it was kind of like no other option. And even after Godzilla was destroyed, he still was kind of, melancholy about it. I feel like, again, there's a missed opportunity. And again, I understand they basically only got Shimura here for this one scene. It does feel like a missed opportunity to not give that portion of it some discussion. And again, I understand that this movie is not trying to do that, but based on what we had from the first movie, it does feel like he's just there just to info dump and nothing else.
Yeah, because I think in this one it's addressed much more just we don't know how to stop Godzilla, but we need answers, and not there really isn't that level of either should we or even some sort of okay, maybe we definitely have to now because this is becoming a recurring problem. Maybe we do have to deal with this.
And I feel like this was a perfect spot for Yamane's perspective on the importance of preserving Godzilla to have a point here, because here, we've got this other creature. The only thing that can stop it is Godzilla. So again, kind of like we had in the legendary films with Serizawa, where he said like Godzilla is, the apex predator. He's kind of like the, he's here to protect the planet from these other creatures. And, one of my favorite lines is when I think it's one of the general or someone says, so what, he'd be our pet? And then Serizawa says, no, we'd be his pets. And I feel like this would have been a good place where Yamane's point of view would actually have made a lot of sense. And it's just left there on the floor.
Yeah, I wonder if they knew that they would be having more movies after this one, if that would have been something more to work on, because that's sort of setting up a overall perspective change in Godzilla. And I think since I think the movie is struggling to realize that that's sort of the process it's going through, I think they don't have any characters that are ahead of the curve on that, because I think the film doesn't realize that's what Godzilla is becoming. So I do kind of wonder.
I think so. I think you're right. I think that they didn't quite know what they were going to be doing with this. I think they had some idea, and that's why they have Godzilla frozen in ice instead of being destroyed, because they're like, well, we don't want to have to go through, and because if they then go through and say like, oh well, here's a third Godzilla, then it would start to border on the ridiculous. So they decided to not go that route, and instead to say like, we're going to keep him literally keep him on ice until we need him again.
Yeah, it's very much a distinction of we've put Godzilla in a way that we think we can call a finish to a film, but we haven't boxed ourselves in. And I said all this is really interesting to compare it to now, where there's so many films that start off and clearly have the markings that they think they're going to be a franchise. I mean, things like the attempt to have like the Mummy create a new universal
That's exactly what I was
kind of
thinking of.
thing,
Yeah.
where you're like, there's so many of these that they've made it, and they're like, there's going to be more of these. And so it's very interesting to see movies that really feel like, certainly the first one was not made with the expectation that there would be more. And this one, I think, was very much not a realization that they'd still be making movies in this franchise now. Right. Let alone that even the Showa era would have like I think about a dozen. And so there's this element where I think it's seeing what happens where there really aren't franchises at this point. So it's kind of seeing what happens when you have to, or certainly not franchises like this. The other ones were a lot more, there's a lot of like, sort of, at least outside Japan, you have a lot of like episodic, mystery solver kind of things that were coming out in the 30s and the 40s, where it's like, these are all, or, Tarzan and stuff like that, where it's very single story things. It was just like, oh, this is what happens with this person this time, but not this concept that, you, with the way Godzilla isn't the central character, you kind of have to structure that in a very different way. Because it's not just what happened to Godzilla this week. Fascinating as though that might be as a concept, that's not where these put the center. And so it has to be a lot more carefully thought out. And it really does feel like, I don't think they really had a template for how to do that. And so a lot of this is seeing them kind of figure that out almost in real time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. It does kind of feel like they thought maybe we can keep this going. And I think there's the hope that lightning would have struck twice, but they also kind of understood that this one could have flopped really badly, especially because I think everybody was understood, like, we are kind of rushing this thing into to release. So there's a chance this can go really, really badly.
Yeah. And I think the addition of, the second kaiju is probably also in that same thing of, right, that is opening a door, and they didn't go, there's 12 of these out there and this is the first one or something.
Right.
It was very much well, that's a thing, so the possibility is there, but you're not really locked into anything.
Yeah.
You haven't promised anything, but you've opened a door that you could revisit. And would they revisit it?
And apparently too, talking about the themes of this, Steve Rifle, who's a film historian, he said that while Godzilla is a metaphor for the Hiroshima bombing, he said he thinks that he feels Godzilla Raids Again is a metaphor for Nagasaki, and he cites this scene of Hidemi looking at the flames of Osaka and how there are parallels to mushroom cloud imagery in that. I mean, I guess that scene, but I don't feel like it. I feel like that feels a bit like a reach to me. I don't think that we don't get that same sense of destructive feel. We don't get any of that sense of, because I mean, the Hiroshima bombing was absolutely devastating. Then a few days later, you had the Nagasaki bombing, and it just completely, utterly destroyed people's faith in that at that time. And I don't feel like this movie gives any of that kind of sense other than that imagery. I think that's just the imagery alone is the only thing we have to go on.
I feel like there's one or two lines that there is something kind of caught my attention slightly in that, but not enough for me to go, I think that's what's going on, but just sort of that kind of, I'd say, is reminiscent of that rather than necessarily feeling like that's what it was going for.
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily surprised that someone has gone for that kind of analogy, because it does also sort of fit into that it wasn't, I feel like it easily could have been, and it's Tokyo again. And so there is some element also of the way that it is somewhere else that slightly feels like that. Although that may also just be me sort of just expecting too many movies to just kind of redo the same thing.
Yeah. And also one final note here, and then we'll have to close this off. But the American version of this originally did not have Godzilla in the title. It was actually called Gigantus, the Fire Monster. And there have been rumors about it, like, they couldn't get the rights to the name Godzilla, but the truth was that they actually thought that, well, because this is a different monster, it shouldn't have the same name. So that's why they went with Gigantus instead.
Yeah, no, I tried a little bit to find that version because I was curious to see what they did to this. Because I think what happened to Godzilla was a butchering when they brought it to the US. And this being not having the same sort of highs, I was kind of wondering how that would end up.
Yeah.
And I was not quite ready to shell out money wherever I would have to like get a physical copy, which I think was what I was down to.
Although,
but
yeah, and it was also well, I don't think they intercut any American actors like they did from the original one.
That's good.
But one of the interesting things about that is that of that dub was that it was George Takei's first acting role.
Yeah, which is a fascinating thought to stumble upon someone just be like, I can't believe this is where they started.
Go show where you never know where your career might take you.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's a good place to end on Godzilla Raids Again. There any final thoughts you wanted to mention about it?
I don't think so. I think I am mostly glad to have contributed towards moving you along that Godzilla franchise to get to some of the other ones in there that I think are more interesting. Some of those for good reasons and some of those for less good reasons. But this is very much that connecting point to at least to the rest of the Showa era.
Yeah, I am curious, and I do eventually want to continue on and watch them. Like, my priority right now is -0. At the time of recording, it hasn't come out yet in Japan on DVD, but it is scheduled to come out. I think May is when it's supposed to be coming out. So I am very much looking forward to that because I understand that it is very much more of the Godzilla, Shin Godzilla type of approach as opposed to like some of the other approaches they've done with the series. So I'm very much excited to dive into that.
Yeah, I missed that in theater and feel confidently that I missed out.
Yeah, unfortunately like I was in the States last summer, but by the time it had released in there, I'd already back in Japan, and I didn't want to watch it without English subtitles. My Japanese it's decent, but it's not quite good enough to understand a movie without any sort of subtitles. So, and I wanted to be able to fully understand that movie when I watched it. But anyway, Mike, thanks so much for coming back on. And why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yes, thanks for having me back on again. For the movie side of things, I'm on Letterboxd at Lobacca, Lowbacca. And then for any interest in retro gaming for the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, you can find us at The Old Switcheroo. That's The Old Switch, AROO.com, or anywhere you can get podcasts. The Old Switcheroo Gaming Retro with Mike and JMO.
Okay, great. Please make sure to check that out. We'll have links to that stuff in the show notes. As for us, JapanOnFilm.com is the website. We are Japan on Film on Blue Sky and Threads and Instagram.
We are also part of the Film Stories Podcast Network, so please make sure to check them out at filmstories.co.uk and listen up after the credits to hear what's coming up next on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit JapanOnFilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on JapanOnFilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.
Fish and chips, cups of tea, the smell of the theatrical grease paint, the roar of the football crowd. A diverse nation grappling with its own long, complex history, always with one tongue firmly in cheek. Over the last century, British film has ebbed and flowed, from Ealing comedy to Carry On sauciness, from the British New Wave to Cool Britannia, from Hammer Horror to Hammer Horror Again. Forget Hollywood, embrace Pinewood. I'm AJ Black, author, writer and podcaster, and I love British film. Join me in a celebration of its quirks, its successes, its failures, and its unique gems at the Pictures in Britain. Please find and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast player of choice. Find the podcast on Linktree, linktr.ee/at the Pictures in Britain. And check out the Film Stories podcast network at www.filmstories.co.uk. See you at the Pictures.